Evelyn Cross was the last person anyone in Ashford expected to find dead in the snow. And Marcus, Dade the quiet janitor with no past, was the last person anyone expected to vanish without a trace. But when one woman's body was discovered beside a frozen lake, and the only clue left behind was a single, perfect footprint, a chilling truth began to unfold. Someone was hunting in silence, and he knew exactly how to disappear. The small town of Ashford was the kind of place where life moved slowly and predictably. Nestled in the folds of a pine-covered valley, it was known more for its antique shops and summer fishing tournaments than anything else. People knew each other by name, kids rode bikes without helmets, and the loudest sounds at night came from owls in the trees. Crime in Ashford was rare, and serious crimes were unheard of until February 6th. That morning, just after sunrise, a jogger, running his usual route around Stillwater Lake, stopped abruptly. Lying near the frozen edge of the water was the lifeless body of Evelyn Cross. She was face down. One arm extended toward the shore, her coat dusted with fresh snow. Her blonde hair was stiff with frost, and the surrounding area was undisturbed, silent, clean, almost too perfect. No drag marks, no broken branches, and no signs of violence. The authorities arrived quickly. Sheriff Tom Mullins, who had handled nothing more severe than parking disputes for over a decade, stood motionless as he looked over the scene. The medical examiner found no wounds, no visible cause of death. Toxicology results would take time, but there was nothing at the scene to suggest Evelyn had died naturally or by her own hand. She had simply ended up dead on the lakeshore with no explanation. Then came the footprint. About 5 feet from her body, embedded deep in the snow, was a single large boot print. It was clean and clear, the pattern distinct enough to be identified as military issue. But that was all there was. No other tracks leading toward it or away from it. No heel marks, no second step, just one solitary footprint facing the lake. That detail turned the case from mysterious to chilling. The local news picked up the story, and for the first time in living memory, Ashford made headlines beyond the county. Theories bloomed. Some said she was killed elsewhere and placed by the lake. Others whispered darker ideas. A ghost, a ritual, a killer who could fly. The townspeople, once carefree and neighborly, grew tense and guarded. Doors were locked, security systems bought, and neighborhood watch groups formed overnight. For the first time, Ashford felt afraid. Not because someone had died, but because whoever had done it had vanished completely, leaving behind only one strange sign. A footprint, and nothing more. The investigation into Evelyn Cross's death quickly took a darker turn. With no cause of death, no witnesses, and no immediate suspects, detectives found themselves chasing shadows. The single boot print left in the snow continued to baffle everyone. It wasn't just an odd clue, it was the only clue, and that was deeply unsettling. Detectives began with Evelyn's personal life, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. She had been a well-respected English teacher at Ashford High for nearly 10 years. Her students described her as kind but private. She lived alone in a small cottage a mile from the lake. No history of mental illness, no known enemies, no romantic relationships that raised concerns. Her finances were stable. Her phone records were ordinary until investigators noticed something strange. For 3 weeks leading up to her death, Evelyn had received several late-night calls from unknown numbers. The calls lasted mere seconds, sometimes less than a ring before they disconnected. They were traced, but each came from a different prepaid phone, purchased in cash from gas stations, hours apart. None of the phones were recovered. It was clear someone had gone to great lengths to remain anonymous. Then came an unexpected breakthrough. A birdwatcher, reviewing footage from a motion-activated trail camera near the lake, came forward with something disturbing. At exactly 12:04 a.m., on the night of Evelyn's death, the camera caught a blurry image of a tall figure walking near the water. The person appeared to be wearing a dark hooded coat and had a noticeable limp. The shape of the figure was distorted by shadows and frost on the lens, but it was clear enough to tell that someone had been there. Yet, when investigators returned to the scene, they couldn't find any corresponding tracks in the snow path leading in and no path leading out. Just the same solitary footprint found by the jogger hours later. It made no sense. Fresh snow had fallen that night, but not enough to completely erase a trail. Why was there only one print? How had this figure disappeared so cleanly? Speculation spread quickly. Some believed the figure had approached from the frozen lake, perhaps using a boat or even crossing the ice. Others clung to more far-fetched theories: paranormal involvement, military experiments, invisible footprints. But despite the growing list of ideas, no hard evidence emerged. The only thing certain was that someone had been there with Evelyn in her final moments. Someone who left no trail, no sound, and no sign, except for one chilling reminder of their presence. The footprint. Nearly a month had passed since Evelyn Cross was found dead, and the investigation had stalled. Leads had dried up, and public fear had started to turn into frustration. The local police, unaccustomed to such a high-profile case, were under pressure. Then, a breakthrough came from someone unexpected: a retired detective named Gerald Knox, who had moved to Ashford a few years earlier after a long career in New York. Knox had followed the story closely. When he saw the photo of the single boot print released in a local newspaper, something clicked. It was the exact pattern he had seen at two separate crime scenes nearly a decade earlier. Both cases had gone unsolved. Both victims had died under strange circumstances. Both scenes had included just one clue: a single military-style footprint, left in isolation. He contacted the sheriff's office and shared the files. With his help, investigators traced the boot to a very specific source: custom military gear issued only to a select group of soldiers in a covert training unit disbanded in 2010. Among the former members, one name stood out: Marcus Dade. Dade's record was complex and troubling. Once a high-ranking field specialist, he had been dishonorably discharged for insubordination and psychological instability. Shortly after his discharge, he disappeared. Though he was briefly a suspect in two mysterious deaths, both victims with connections to military research, no charges had been filed. There was no evidence, just rumors, footprints. Now, with Evelyn's death and the identical clue, Marcus Dade was suddenly the center of attention. The next step was finding him. That task proved harder than expected. A search of local employment records revealed something shocking. For the past 8 months, Marcus had been living in Ashford under a fake name, working as a night janitor at Ashford High School, the very place where Evelyn taught. No one had suspected a thing. Kept to himself, did his job, and vanished without notice just days before Evelyn's body was discovered. When investigators arrived at the apartment listed under his alias, they found it abandoned. Inside, the walls were bare. No personal items, no electronics, no fingerprints. But tucked away behind a loose floorboard was a single photograph of Evelyn Cross. Standing at the front of a classroom, smiling, the photo had been torn in half, then taped back together. Marcus had been close, watching, waiting. With that discovery, the case changed. The footprint was no longer just a symbol of mystery, it was Marcus Dade's calling card. And now, the quiet town of Ashford had a name for the darkness it feared. But finding him would be another matter entirely. As winter deepened, Ashford remained locked in fear. The revelation about Marcus Dade sent shockwaves through the community. The idea that a trained killer had been living among them, unnoticed and unchecked, turned paranoia into panic. Security systems sold out. Schools hired private guards. Town meetings turned into arguments, with residents demanding answers that no one could give. Then, before the town could recover, another body was found. Paul Granger, a 62-year-old local historian, was discovered dead in his study. The door had been locked from the inside. At first glance, it looked like a heart attack. He was slumped over his desk, coffee spilled near his hand, eyes closed as if he'd simply dozed off and never awakened. But the coroner noticed a small, nearly invisible puncture behind his right ear. Toxicology confirmed what few wanted to believe: Paul had been injected with a fast-acting poison. It was a targeted, efficient kill. Professional. The pattern repeated. No signs of struggle. No surveillance footage of anyone entering or leaving. And outside his window, barely visible in the freshly fallen snow, was a single footprint. This time, authorities dug deeper into Paul's background. What they found drew a disturbing connection. In the 1990s, Paul Granger had worked as a civilian researcher for a classified military program. The project had focused on psychological warfare, specifically training soldiers to operate in extreme conditions, eliminate targets silently, and vanish without detection. It had been quietly shut down, deemed too unstable and morally questionable. Among the soldiers in that program, Marcus Dade. The pieces began falling into place. Marcus hadn't just been trained to fight, he had been molded to disappear, to kill without leaving evidence. It explained the missing footprints. The ability to evade cameras, the knowledge of how to manipulate a scene. This wasn't a random act of violence, it was a methodical purge. Authorities theorized that Marcus believed Evelyn and Paul were threats either because they knew something, or because he thought they would expose him. But there was no concrete proof. Marcus was still a ghost. Every lead ended with the same frustration. Empty rooms, no DNA, no digital footprint. Just that one haunting sign left behind, as if mocking the investigators. People who had once brushed off conspiracy theories now paid attention. Stories about Marcus's training grew darker with each telling. Rumors of experimental conditioning, mental manipulation, even hypnotic control. The line between man and myth began to blur. Ashford wasn't just hunting a killer. They were chasing a weapon, one that had been built to disappear. And the only way they knew he had been there was the mark he left behind. A footprint, standing alone in the snow. A year had nearly passed since Evelyn Cross's murder, and Ashford remained gripped by unease. No new sightings of Marcus Dade had been reported, but his presence lingered like fog over the town. Every creak at night, every shadow caught in the corner of an eye, stirred the same thought: he was still out there watching. The investigation had gone cold, until one last clue pulled detectives into the final chapter of the case. An anonymous tip was called into the sheriff's office. A quiet voice, distorted and brief, led authorities to a remote barn on the outskirts of Ashford. The property had been abandoned for years, a relic of a long-forgotten farmstead. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and cold, but what they found within made it clear someone had been living there recently and deliberately. In the loft was a makeshift hideout, a cot, a stack of unopened canned food, water bottles lined neatly along the wall. Most chilling of all were the maps pinned to the beams. Each map marked routes in and out of Ashford, walking trails, sewer systems, back roads. There were red circles drawn around key buildings. The school, the sheriff's office, the post office, and dozens of homes. Among them were photos taken from a distance of people who lived in those homes. People who now realized they had been watched. Near the edge of the loft was a notebook, filled with scribbles, notes, and what appeared to be surveillance logs. Days and times, who came and went, when lights turned on and off. It was methodical, almost obsessive. On the final page, a hand-drawn image stood out, a perfect sketch of the boot print. Next to it, a single sentence written in clean, deliberate handwriting. They'll never follow what they cannot see. That night, before authorities could return with forensic teams, the barn burned to the ground. No trace of the notebook, maps, or photographs survived. The fire was ruled arson, and it had been set with skill fast, hot, and clean. The final lead, just like the man they were chasing, had vanished. No new murders followed, no more footprints. But fear remained. Residents became hyper-aware of their surroundings. Some moved away. Others installed more cameras, motion lights, and reinforced doors. But even with all the precautions, one fear never left them: that he could return at any time. No sound, no warning, just a single footprint in the snow, and nothing else.